You know, I did all that stuff. By the way, since Ed's going last, he's picking up all the drinks at the bar. So glad to have such a great crowd here today, and face-to-face for a change. You know, we all keep talking about that, but I am so zoomed out, and I'm sure y'all are. It's really nice to see something different. I'm sure for all of you in the room, a lot of this is old hat, but hopefully you'll walk away with at least one new thing you didn't know or something to think about that you had forgotten about. This presentation was actually developed by Larry Wilkins in Alabama and myself, and we used it to train ABI inspectors a few years ago. I just modified it to make it a little bit less inspector type and more down to the engineering type. We'll talk a little bit about the history of the alternative inspection program. This program's actually been going on since the late 90s. It was started by FCC inspectors in Kansas City, Missouri, and it spread all across the United States. The program basically gives you a free pass for 3 years when you sign up. Every state is different. I know in Alabama and Georgia, it's part of your membership. In South Carolina, there is a fee. I believe in Tennessee, there is a fee. But it's well worth it. It's very affordable. Basically, what we do as inspectors is come in and provide a mock FCC type inspection. Normally, when the FCC comes in, hopefully they're only looking for one thing. They've been assigned to work a certain zip code or a certain state, and maybe look for EAS problems or tower light problems, and then that information is sent back to the mothership in Washington. But as you all well know, if they walk in and they start to see one thing bad, they start digging and digging and digging, and they walk away usually with several pages of potential violations, and that's the situation you don't want to get into. So the program is really an educational type program. Yes, we do have some stations that do fail an inspection. We try not to have that happen. We really want all stations to pass. And plus, we want to help those stations that aren't passing to pass, because a lot of times stations don't realize that they have an error. I've walked into stations before that they thought they only had to monitor one EAS station for some reason. So those are the kind of things you run into that we try to prevent along the way. So I've hit the goals already of what we're trying to do. How many of you deal with online public files for your local radio or TV station? Any of you? We'll mention this very briefly. I know now that most of the public, well, all the public files are online. Most engineers have so much work, they don't have time to deal with the public file. In the past, it used to be the engineer dealt with the public file, as well as a number of other FCC-related items, because it was just all part of FCC work. And the engineer was, quote unquote, had a license or used to have a license with the FCC. The biggest gotchas in the FCC online public file are those documents that you're required to file on a regular basis. And it used to be children's reports were one of those. And of course, the children's reports are now filed once a year, so that's only a once a year gotcha. But the biggest issue that we find are quarterly issues in programs. People just seem to have an issue with that. Most stations really do a good job of providing information and programming to specific issues that are in each community. They just do a really lousy job of documenting this kind of information. So you see more times than not that the stations do not file the reports on time, or they don't file them at all for some reason. And especially during the last renewal, which is still ongoing, a lot of stations were late or did not have quarterly issues and programs uploaded, and they are now receiving fines from the commission. I mean, we've seen fines of $5,000 and $10,000, maybe some higher in certain cases, or even a couple of cases of short-term license renewals. So if the quarterly issues and programs are supposed to be filed by the 10th of the quarter, at the end of the quarter, that would be January, February, March, so it'd be 10th of April, for example. Please be sure it's there on or before the 10th, because The Commission knows. If you look real well at the website where the online public files are, there's documentation of who filed, when they filed, and the exact time they filed. So they're watching this type of stuff, and you don't want to get caught in that gotcha. The other thing, and especially if you deal with small market broadcasters, is the political file. Now, we're in an off-political season this year. Next year it's going to be a hotbed. But the Commission is very specific about all the documents and reports that are associated with an inquiry or an actual purchase of broadcast time by a politician, that information should be filed within 24 hours of when you receive that documentation and that order. Not 28 hours, not 36 hours, not sometime during the week. They're very specific about 24 hours. And I know a station just recently, they didn't get a fine, but they were able to work out an arrangement with the Commission that as part of their plea bargain, they had to provide a dedicated person to deal with the FCC political file. They had to provide a guidebook for all members of the staff. They had to do ongoing training. And not only does this last with that station, but it carries over to any new or successive ownerships for a number of years. So those are some of the things that you can run into. We're starting to see a lot more issues and fines and penalties being handed down by the Commission.
Did someone complain? Is that what brought that on, or was it just?
You know, it's a good question, because the ABIP inspection, the Commission really doesn't want us to dig into the public file like we used to. We did all that because it was a paper file and they had no way of looking at it. But I'm guessing that somebody is complaining, and it might be a politician, somebody who's running for office came in and they wanted to look at your public file, or they don't have to go in anymore. All they have to do is go online and they say, look, I know that I filed these documents in this order 2 days ago. Why hasn't it been uploaded? So they'll form a complaint right there, because it's hard to know exactly, unless it's a dead giveaway. I mean, the date on the purchase order might say October the 15th, and you see that it was uploaded on October the 20th, well, you know they're in violation. So somebody is sitting up there with a bunch of interns, and they're going through it and looking at all these documents. So it's just one of those gotchas you've got to be careful for. So, you know, spend a little time with the public file if you deal with those issues, or advise your station manager or owner, you know, who's dealing with all these issues. This is something that the Commission really cares about. Now, there's some non-required or non-public file documents that are required that we always look for when we go in and do an inspection. And for ABM is NRSC measurements. That's a gotcha, because you're supposed to have the measurements from the past 2 years. The NRSC measurements are supposed to be done between 12 and 14 months every year. And they're supposed to be kept at the station. It can be put in the public file, online public file. If you do that, there's another little gotcha. If you don't keep it updated, then everybody in the world knows it. Or you need to keep them in an engineering file at the radio station. Now, what I recommend for most engineers is that document be kept at the transmitter site as well as the studio, so you have it at multiple locations. Station log, we'll talk a lot about this, but station log is a big gotcha these days. Station log consists of EAS and tower light and any abnormal operations. And then tower structure registration. And that's an interesting one, because not as much so right now, we don't have a lot of stations transferring ownership, but when you transfer ownership, the registration also is required to be transferred, or you could incur fines over that, and sometimes people just forget about that. You would think the attorney that's handling the transfer of the operation of the radio station and all the paperwork would remember that, but that is usually one place that they absolutely forget. And then you go back and you look some months later and say, oh my God, they didn't transfer the license and you for the registration, and you've got to deal with that right away, because the Commission will get you on that. Now, most of the time, especially on the FM side, television side, stations transfer all the time, but the towers are owned by American Tower or Vertical Bridge or some other company, and they deal with those things. So that's something you want to, little gotcha you want to look after. Now, quarterly tower light inspection. This hits a lot of people. If you are on a tower that is operated and owned by another company, like I mentioned earlier, Vertical Bridge or Crown Castle or American Tower, they're responsible for quarterly tower light. They're responsible for all the monitoring because they own the tower. But if they fail in their job, guess who's the next person in line? All the licensees on that tower. And trust me, the commission will call you and they will come after you. So you want to be sure that your landlord is doing their job. A good recommendation is to have a letter that documents this information, that states basically, I, the tower owner, are responsible for quarterly tower lights and ongoing tower light inspections per FCC rules and regulations. And this relieves station WW or whatever of that responsibility, and had it signed by a company official as such, and put it in with your FCC licenses, because you want as much protection as you can. But again, if the tower owner fails, you're next in line. Yes, sir.
With, say, American Tower, just picking one.
Sure.
If you've got a tower that, and you can address from the ABIP's perspective, but from the commission perspective, say you've got a tower with the tower lights out and they've been out for 6 months. In American Tower, just picking one, right? Knows about it, but they're saying, well, we're going to allocate funds and replace it, and we don't know what we're going to do. What is the rule of thumb for the point in time when I, the broadcaster, should send a notice or document? What do you recommend?
Good question, and a loaded question. That seems to vary. Now, first of all, I would say be sure that we're using American Tower in this instance, has filed notems.
Right.
And that the notems are current and updated at all times. So, in that particular case, they have done what they're supposed to be doing, but the commission and or the FAA can cite them and demand that they correct the problems immediately. They've been ongoing too long. I had a case recently where there was a reported tower light outage, and the FAA, it was reported by a citizen to the FAA. The FAA immediately called the FCC. The FCC called the owner and said, you've had too many problems. Now, they did have some ongoing problems in a previous year, about 4 or 5. They always filed a notem, and they hadn't had any problems 6 or 8 months since then. And the problem turned out not to be an issue. I think it was a misguided report. But anyway, the commission immediately called, and they said, wait a minute, what's going on up there? You've had too many issues. So a lot of this deals with the inspector at the commission office, what office it is. They may react differently in Miami, Florida than they do in Atlanta, Georgia, than they do in Norfolk, Virginia. So now as a leaseor on that tower, or leasee on that tower, I would probably be in communications and saying, okay, this has been going on now for 3 months. What are you going to do about it? Give me a letter and documentation of what's ongoing, and I would stick that in my files to know that you have been a responsible individual and that you showed your concern and you had actually made contact with them as such. I mean, you can't have enough documentation in those cases.
I think it's responsibility of the local engineer to document the date that he notices.
Well, that is correct. But now, if it's owned by another entity, then that's a little bit different ballgame. That's why I say it's good to have that letter that you have there to ensure that you're covered and there is an understanding between you and that owner that your responsibility has been relieved. But yes, you still carry responsibility in an indirect way. Equipment performance measurements are the other issue. Now, it's a really gray area. It's still in the rules, but technically you should be checking your spectrum on a regular basis, and that means you have to have a spectrum analyzer and the appropriate equipment, and most TV stations, that's a standard item in a TV operation. Radio, that's a rarity. I mean, Ed may carry one, Vic, you may carry one, several of you, that I don't know personally may have spectrum analyzers, but again, for radio stations, that's an issue. Typically, the commission, NRSC, you have to do on an annual basis. FM is usually if you change any part of the transmission equipment, such as if you put in a new transmitter, that's a given. You have to run a whole new spectrum analysis and have documentation on that. But what most people don't realize, anything inside that transmission system at the plant has to be, if you change it, you have to measure it. That means the audio processor, because the stereo generator is inside the audio processor in most cases. So if you swap out your Orban for an Omnia 9 or 11 or whatever, or vice versa, you're supposed to run a spectral analysis and check that, so that equipment performance measurement. Schedule of maintenance logs. I find this a lot. You go to a site. Now, again, more gray area. They just say a maintenance log should be kept for regular visits to the transmitter site. So what do you call regular visits? How many people go to their transmitter site once a week? How many go every other week? Monthly? Okay, so what happens here is the commission just, if you go monthly and you feel that that's acceptable for your transmitter site and your station management agrees to that, you should at least have a log out there showing you're going by. You can go stop by CVS or Walmart or whatever and pick up a 50-cent notebook and a pen and open it up and put on October the 5th, visited transmitter site, all parameters operating normally per FCC rules and regulations, blah, 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 signed John George, October the 5th or whatever the date is. You go 2 weeks later, check the parameters, maybe it's an AM, you throw in the base current reading in there and everything's normal and you sign it. That's what they want to see. A lot of guys go weekly, a lot of guys go bi-weekly, depends on the number of stations you're dealing with and your organization. It can be done electronically, it can be done in a notebook, but you need to have some type of records and documentation for this. And yes, I know there are probably a lot of stations that don't get a visit from a transmitter an engineer until it goes off the air, but document it. RF hazard signs, again, they should be on fences all around the transmitter site, probably the door of the transmitter building. They're not very expensive, $25 to $35, depending on how big you want it and what size target you want for the neighborhood and that kind of thing, but at least put the signs up there. And also know your community. You may need to put bilingual signs up, because the last thing you want is somebody climbing over that fence and getting electrocuted or whatever the case is. The signs protect you and provide that additional protection from your liability. Ed?
John, I thought I understood that the RF safety signs and the tower registration need to be sort of at the entrance to the property from the nearest public road or something, so that anybody on the property is warned, rather than 2,000 feet in and posted on a gate or something on the fence. Where do they need to be posted?
Okay, I would put them around the base of the tower, especially if it's an AM. I don't care if you've got 4 AM towers out in the field and the field is totally fenced. Put them around each fence. Yes, put them on the gate when you come in, put them on the building. So it's really not a FCC rule. This leans more toward OSHA and protection. The same thing with putting high voltage signs up and warning signs. Because case recently down in Orlando, Florida, a guy climbed an 8-foot fence. And fence was in excellent condition. Cut the copper away, and somehow or another got out of there. Caused the station a lot of headaches. He did get away. We know he got hurt because we saw droplets of blood all around the base of the tower when he cut the copper. And all we could do is call the police. They come out, they file a report, they see that we had signage and notification up and that kind of thing. The problem is if somebody gets hurt, who are they going to sue? They're going to come to you. So you hoping that would give you some protection. Now, talking about signage briefly, not RF radiation, you have to put the tower registration information, and I'll mention this again later, but I think it's a good time now since it came up. But tower registration information, which of course is your ASR number, the ownership and contact number, needs to be on a fence where your driveway stops. In other words, if your driveway stops at a gate that's a mile up the road, that's fine, you put it there. If it's on a gate that's at the entrance to your transmitter site, and that's 5 miles from the transmitter site, and nobody can get past that gate, that's where those signs need to be posted. So consider this, the inspector wants to come and look at your tower, and he can only go so far. He needs to be seeing a sign somewhere around that gate, across that highway or dirt road or whatever it is, or driveway, that he can read that registration number. So that is a requirement, and one of those little things that'll get you. Coaxial tower, paint on the tower. I know when you paint your tower, be sure that the tower crews paint the coax on the tower. I've seen some towers had so many coax lines on it that instead of being orange and white, they look black. So you want to be sure that that's painted. An efficiency factor for FM. I feel like, at least with Larry and when Frank was with us and myself, we finally got most FM sites that have inspections on an ongoing basis. They have their efficiency factor posted on their transmitter. It can be on the transmitter, it can be, on your documentation, your maintenance log or whatever, but the FCC wants to know the efficiency factor of the transmitter. Now we're going to talk about our good old friend EAS, the Emergency Alert System. To this very day, we still do inspections, and we find stations that don't have EAS units or are still using the old EAS units like the TFTs and the early gray Sage box. It's amazing. We've even had a call from an FCC inspector saying, look, I'm at such and such site. He's going to call you. Can you just get him an EAS unit so we can make it legal? I mean, the guys from the FCC are good people. They really, want stations to be operating in a legal way, but that actually occurred. But there are people out there without EAS. And of course, most of y'all know the current EAS box from Sage, and then there's DASDAC. I guess more Sage boxes go to radio and more DASDACs go to television just because of the ease of interfacing with the two different systems. Operational requirements, and again, I'm preaching to the choir here. Receive a weekly required test from both assigned monitor sources. That means your LP1 and your LP2. Not one, but both. Don't forget that. You also have to receive a required weekly test from iPods. That's where you plug a network cable into the back of your EAS box, and that test comes down at least Eastern time at 11:01 a.m. normally every Monday morning. Yes, sir.
I know of 2 states where the state emergency people have told the radio station that as long as they monitor the state emergency or IPAWS, that that's enough to log, and the federal one, they don't have to worry about.
If it's from IPOS, now, if the state is passing that through on Monday morning, just passing it right on through, and it's from IPOS, and that means national, FEMA, that's okay. But if the state tells them, no, our test can supersede that national test, do not do that. Because that national test, that is one thing the commission's very particular about. I mean, when they first started inspecting to be sure that all the software and all the units had been updated for IPOS, I know the commission was going around, and they weren't just looking at the front of the box, they were looking at the back to see if, one, there was a network cable plugged in, and two, if there was network activity on it. So,
Let me ask something before you go on.
sure.
I don't understand, since the whole studio, requirement went out the window, a lot of, transmitter sites now have like all your equipment there. Why in the world are they still designating AM stations to be your primary relay? With all the noise, electrical mess, it's insane.
Most of them are FM. Give me an example of an AM.
Yeah, I got some stations in Texas that's got AM as a primary relay. I'm like, why can't we get it redesignated?
Well, you certainly, now there is a rule that allows you to request a new station if you're having problems picking it up. In some areas, AMs are used because of the large coverage. For example, in the Midwest, WLW is obviously a relay station. But in most cases, especially in the East Coast, we try to do all FM. But now when you get into Texas, there may be a case where there's not an FM that has the coverage of the AM, and that's why they still use AM. I mean, ground conductivity out there, you could take a 1 kilowatt station here in Georgia and it'll cover, let's say 10, 15, 20 miles, and you go out to Texas, it covers 50 miles because there's nothing but granite rock here. So, but if you do have an issue and you can't pick up a station as part of the relay network, you can talk to your state SECC chairman, which, State Emergency Communications Committee chairman, and they're supposed to work with you and find you a different assignment if you legitimately have an issue. Or if it's AM, there's some really good AM antennas out there if you don't mind paying $400 or $500 for it. So,
I had this guy build one actually.
yeah, and they work very, very well. But I mean, that's one thing you can certainly do, and that's why AM is still utilized a lot in the PEP program, which is Primary Entry Point Program, or Entry Point Program. There, a majority of the stations are AM stations, 50 kilowatts, because they cover so much of the country and can reach such far distances. And the idea was to cover as much population as possible. They have filled in with a lot of FMs of late, but AM is still pretty important on the coverage side.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
We're a PBS affiliate on the broadcast TV side.
Okay.
In addition to the IPAWS and the EAS, which we use the stage index for, we've also got a warrant system.
Mm-hmm.
How does that, I don't really have to deal with it because we have a remote master control that deals with that side of it. But I was just curious, how does that, in the chain of, what's the word?
Are you in Georgia?
Yeah.
Okay, GPB.
Well, no, I'm with WAPWPA.
Oh, okay, Budweiser.
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm
all right, yeah, okay. More than likely what they have is part of the, oh gosh, now I can't think of the name of it, but it's a direct satellite link that comes in.
It's a leach interface, it's a leach box, and it's has cards in it.
Okay, that's a
Just send
different,
us a new one.
that's different. That is not part of the EAS operations, but what they do, they go pull information out.
It sounds like it's parallel to.
Yeah, it's more of a parallel thing to be able to put graphics on TV. TV stations a lot of times use alternate methods of getting the same information on. As long as they're doing that, they don't necessarily have to run the EAS activation because their equipment is already putting it on the air.
We still have our INDAC in line with our transmitter, so it sends a text call with it. when we run.
Right,
across.
right.
I was just, I've never seen a warn.
Yeah, it's a parallel type thing.
Okay.
Are you leaving the iPods right now? I had an iPods question.
Oh, go ahead.
We got some stations, and this iPods thing seems to be all over the board, but we get CAE alerts, which is Amber Alerts.
Right.
All right, when the Amber Alert comes over iPods, you have all of your description information there.
Right.
Which is the perpetrator, the person that's been abducted, whatever. All right, some states are transmitting this thing over NOAA weather. When they do that, all that description goes away.
Yep.
And all you'll have is there's an Amber Alert for whatever county. And it's totally useless because you don't know who, what, where you're going.
Well, that, you have to understand with EAS, you have less than 2 minutes of information you can pass out. Now, under iPods, you can send out, I mean, technically you can transmit pictures if you needed to over iPods. So, National Weather Service, they're limited as well too, because radio and TV monitor their facilities, so if they go over a certain time, it'll just chop it off. So that's why a lot of times you may only hear an Amber Alert's been issued for such and such county, and usually they will vocally say, please tune to local media for additional information and that kind of thing. But they're working, the National Weather Service has been working for about the past 10 years, along with the folks at FEMA, to be able to combine those two systems and be able to transmit much more data and much more site-specific data. You know, those FIPS codes that we all use can always go down to even county zip code areas. We just don't utilize it yet, and that's where they're headed.
Well, I know a lot of this, they're not actually monitoring the results. You got somebody pushing the button to send out the alert, and they think that, you know, their job is done. And nobody really monitors what actually airs as far as any descriptions or anything.
Then-
John, in radio, we've had this problem forever when the salesperson brings in 2.5 minutes worth of copy.
Yep.
And they want a 30, they bought a 30-second.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
But on a similar problem that we have in Tennessee, you know, Tennessee, it takes almost 10 hours to drive from one end to the other of Tennessee, from Memphis to Bristol, right? And
Last time I did it, 8.
Okay. That would be our secret.
Yeah.
But, you know, Sunday morning, Forest Hills Baptist Church, Brentwood, Tennessee, you can pretty well count on it. Everybody in the congregation, their phones are in alert. And it's a child in Memphis that's been abducted, and because the Tennessee, the TBI, their area is Tennessee, the kid may very well be in South Haven, Mississippi, or in West Memphis, Arkansas. But no, Bristol's getting the alert too.
Well, don't forget that yes, South Haven is getting it, and probably the folks over in Arkansas are getting it, and maybe Kentucky is getting it. But that's one thing I would say you really need to talk to folks at Tennessee about. I mean, the biggest thing any of you can do when you have these issues is talk to the SECC in your local state. Also talk to your particular emergency management division. It's GEMA here, South Carolina, EMD. Tennessee is, let's see, TMED, I think it is, or TEMA. So what you need to do is the broadcasters need to have ongoing conversations with those people to try to remedy some of those issues. And they're willing to listen, but the biggest problem is usually we never ask, we just complain, and then it happens. Of course, the other, getting back to EAS directly, the other requirement is you have to transmit a weekly test on all stations and secondary audio and video streams. And that means if you're running, your TV station is 10.1 and you have .2, .3, .4, you've got to run it on all the .2, .3, .4 stations. And if you're HD, it needs to run on the HD station. So, and this is a little interesting fact. Let's say you lease your station, your HD signal, because a lot of that's been going on, say HD3, to another group. And they're broadcasting whatever their programming is, and they're coming out of another county. It might be a different operational area. So if it is, that station's still licensed to you. You have to interrupt and provide the equipment to be sure it's being carried in your local operational area. So again, be sure that your .1, .2, .3s and all that are covered, as well as your HD2s, 3s with the appropriate operational area.
So no matter who you're carrying, it's your city of license, basically.
That's correct, because it's licensed to you. It's licensed to you. Even though you may have LMA'd or whatever you want to call it, leased out to somebody else for your HD2 or 3, it's still your license, so you have to be responsible for that. So that might mean you have separate EAS equipment to just cover that HD2, 3, or 4. Now, of course, we mentioned receive required monthly test on all stations. Again, all secondary audio and video streams within a 60-minute window. Just had happen in my home state of South Carolina. I saw one of the TV stations running a monthly test at 5:59 in the evening. The test went about 10:10 that morning, out of tolerance. So, and I get to inspect them in a couple of years. I'll have to keep that in my notes. And of course, the national, we all know about the national. The big requirement is you have to receive and transmit any kind of national information on all stations and the secondary audio and video streams. And of course, maybe next time around we won't be doing a relay chain, we'll be doing the IPAWS chain. They keep rotating it around for testing, but keep that in mind. You want to be sure that your equipment is working properly for the national test. And
That's the once a year one we just had.
that's the once a year one we just have, and trust me, when you look at some of the reports, it's some crazy answers that go out there as to why they didn't run a test. Somebody stole my equipment. And I don't think the commission would accept that. All right. We mentioned station log earlier. Be sure that you record all the information of EAS operations in the station log. Station log must be reviewed and certified weekly by the station chief operator or his designee, and logs must be retained for 2 years. Big problem still. Big problem. That doesn't mean that, I've received it, I printed it, or actually I downloaded it from my Sage box and I PDF'd it and it's saved on my laptop. I go to look at it, there's no signature, there's no date, there's no way he reviewed it. So you're in violation. If you want to download that particular file and you want to sign a note on there and say, certified that all the information ran, and put some check marks on there, and then PDF and save it, that's fine. If you want a paper log, we developed a paper log that we use a lot in the southeast that you can handwrite all this information in, that's fine too. But be sure you review that information, you put it in some form that shows that you've actually reviewed it and documented and save it, and it has to be for 2 years. And if your hard drive crashes, that doesn't count. If your EAS box crashes, that doesn't count. So sometimes paper is a handy thing to have unless you have plenty of backups handy. Okay, we mentioned about all the information for EAS operations on the station log. Information about malfunction tower lights, which I think we've already talked about. You certainly want to note that, and be sure that when you note that when you call in to, I forgot what the company is now these days that you call into, is it Boeing or one of the aircraft companies or aircraft specialty companies that handle all the FAA stuff, be sure that you get either the operator's initials or he gives you some code number to prove that you actually talked to that individual. And they'll give it to you if you ask for it. And of course, information about any transmission system failures or repairs, which is, obviously a given, but most people don't write those down anymore. Let's off do we go to the transmitter site. Tower light requirements. Well, we also have painting requirements. So these charts are pretty much readily available. There is a document that always comes with your license that pertains to the tower that you own and covers the FAA paint and lighting requirements. If you have a really, really old tower and it says one beacon at 375 feet and a side marker, hang on to those documents, because all that's changed and you don't want to touch anything in that tower. You want to keep it all absolutely the same so that there are no problems. Actually, there's some cases of where towers were registered and back in the 1970s because of the power, we were running out we had power crisis, gasoline crisis and everything in the early 70s. The FAA allowed towers that were not in flight paths to extinguish their lights. I know right now the 2-tower directional array in South Carolina that's 375 feet and they have no lights on it at all, and they have a letter from the FAA that gave them permission to do that. Yes, so be sure you hang on to that document, because if you ever lose that document, you're in hot water. Here's the chart on the high-intensity dual obstruction lighting standards. They vary a little bit differently from the typical incandescent or LED beacon type standards now. How many people have seen one of these? Anybody know what this is? This is a paint chart. They're actually available. They're about $80 a piece. If you buy one, keep it in the envelope all the time, because they fade just like paint will. But this is what we use to go check tower paint when you're out in the field. Each FCC inspector and an FAA inspector will carry one of those. If they have any question about your tower, they'll be up there holding it up to the tower legs to see what the international orange looks like. They're handy tool to have around if you have multiple stations and you want to check them from time to time. I believe the company is out of the Tampa, Florida area. I can't remember the name of it.
GRE or GME, I just bought a new one. It's
Yeah.
like $74 for the post and everything.
So there you go. They're available.
Throw them out of light, and I also keep a piece of tissue paper out of the shoebox between, because if that paint chips rub together.
Yep, they'll go back. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I hope none of you have a tower that looks like that.
I think all the colors.
Well, he's got a little bit of everything on there, and he even has built-in beam tilt.
That's after the took all the colors off.
Yeah. Now, of course, most of them look like that, or like this. Now, we talked earlier about RF radiation signs, and of course, again, I do caution you, if you're in an area with a lot of bilingual people, I would put up an appropriate sign accordingly. Now, this is a tool, I threw this in. This is just a GPS tool, but it's for, locating accurate GPS coordinates of wherever you happen to be at that particular moment. But we can check towers that way. That's the way the FCC checks towers, with a similar GPS device. Of course, there are different coordinates set up, NAD 27, NAD 82, I think it is. Thank you. But anyway, you want to be sure that you use the appropriate one if you're checking your tower coordinates. And there's still towers that are not on the proper coordinates these days. Tower registration signs, you can make your own. You can order one and put the appropriate numbers on it, but be sure that any tower that you have that has a registration ASRN number has one of these signs. I've actually got a 30-foot tower that was required to have an ASR registration number. It's on a 4-story building, and when we moved an FM site to the 4-story building as a backup, the FAA freaked out and says, "How can you do that? It doesn't pass the slope test." And I said, "Well, we're right next to a building that's 20 stories. "Well, how could that be? You're in line with the runway." I said, "That's because they changed the runway locations about 30 years ago, and we were already there. But they made us put an ASRN number on this little tower on a 4-story building in the middle of downtown Columbia, South Carolina, and I have my registration number on the door going up to the roof." Let's talk about AEM a little bit. Anybody got an AEM guy? Okay, we don't have too many AM people in here before. That's the antenna tuning unit, and a fairly nice antenna tuning unit. You know, it could use a little cleaning there. That's something we always look at, and that's something you want to be very careful with because you can easily get an RF burn just opening the door to look at the AM. Of course, in that particular unit right now, we do see a sample transformer in the bottom right, but there's no base current meter in there. They could add by plugging in right here. They could plug in a base current meter, and then they would pull out the switch here, and of course it would operate accordingly, and you get your base current meter and then put it back. I don't know why I can't think of what they call the plug. J-plug. Thank you. Brain dead today. And of course, there's a typical meter, thermocouple meter that's used on a J-plug. Most people, I don't see these as much as I do the Delta meters anymore, but occasionally these are extremely hard to find and very expensive. This is a fairly common meter here, RF ammeter from Delta. The Torah device on the left is obviously for the sample, the meters on the right. You have your cable that interconnects, and of course these cables are length specific, so if you get one and you have 8 extra feet in there, you just coil it up appropriately and keep it out of the way of other components. You can't cut it. A port here for a remote sample, and of course the switch for on and off. And there is actually a little piece of plastic on the end of this because that's a metal switch, and you'll get the crap knocked out of you if you aren't careful when you reach in there and there's high RF in that ATU. So keep that in mind.
If I understand right, something I heard recently is that the FCC is actually looking at getting to the point where they don't even care what you write in your transmitter log that your transmitter's output power was. That's what they're going to want to
Well, in AM, this is technically, this is what it is. If it says 4.5 amps, it doesn't matter what that transmitter says. I mean, if you're required to put up 6 amps and your transmitter reads 92%, which is fairly common on a lot of the solid-state transmitters, or it might, if it was 5 kilowatts and it reads 4.5, you still go by the base current reading. That is the direct method, as they call it. That's the new digital. I've yet to ever see one of these digital meters. It's really nice, but it comes with a nice price too.
Who made that?
That's Delta as well. Yeah.
Is it Delta and Bird, or does it
Bird does not do any AM. Bird does strictly all communications except AM. Delta is the one who does the AM stuff. And yet you can still find the thermocouple meters and the sample units for thermocouple meters. I know that Kentronics carries them, and FaceTech also has them. And a lot of times you can find these things used on the market, but you got to be sure of the accuracy of them. And of course, to ensure the accuracy, you would use the power equals current squared equals times resistance, and you would have what your actual power output would be, and that should match up very closely with your ammeter on the base current. And of course the other chart. And we'll look a little bit more at AMs briefly. I don't think this base current meter works anymore. You see a lot of stuff inspecting AMs like this. And of course, obviously, you can't pass somebody like that until they complete the repairs. And that's just good raw power. I don't know if any of you have seen this. This is one of an AM monitor. This is pretty much standard in the industry. This is used for AM directional arrays. So this would be used for a 2-tower array, and more than likely nighttime, sometime daytime arrays, but this is the old analog style. They're a case where you have what they call a critical array, where the requirements are much stricter in these type of arrays. And as you can tell, you're looking up here, there's 12 towers. And I don't know too many of those arrays. There's one up around, there's several in Detroit, and I know there's one across the river from Buffalo in St. Catharines that's 12 towers. It's 5 and 5, 2 in the middle, and an FM on one end. And there are your directional parameters. This is fairly typical, but again, go by what your license says. It's all printed out on your FCC license. Anybody know what this is? Okay. Good old field intensity meter. Let's see, that one is the FIM, I believe 21 there. And there are two versions, a 21 and a 41. And they make a new digital.
Who makes these?
I'm sorry?
Manufacturer that makes it?
Oh, Potomac.
Oh.
Yeah. Actually, that one's not manufactured anymore. You can still find them used on the market. Typically, the going rate these days, or the value of that particular unit's around $5,000 or $6,000. You can find them at much less. You can send them to Potomac they should be calibrated about every 2 years. And they will charge you, depending on what's wrong with it, $1,000, $1,500 for calibration. Now, if I come into your station, it's an AM directional, I don't want to have to pull out my field meter, and because you don't have one. The commission does require that every AM directional have access to a field meter. And that means you own it, or you better have somebody close by that loans you one on a regular basis to check those monitor points. And by the way, you should still check your monitor points, whether it be quarterly or however often as you feel, and log that information in a notebook. And this is just compliance, predicted distance on the fencing. And of course, that's getting ready to change somewhat depending on the new OET 69 rules. Yes, we see a lot of these. The commission shows up. Well, first of all, you got a major fence issue. Yeah, you got a tower that needs painting right off the bat. And then you're going to have a good grass fire before it's all over with. And I'll tell a story on CJ. He's not here. I'm sorry, but I'll still tell it. We were up in Greenville, South Carolina when he lived there, working on a 50 kilowatt AM. And we sent, it was two of us in on the Continental 317. We sent CJ out to the 50 kilowatt daytime tower. And we'd cleaned the transmitter. It had been operated, made some repairs. And, we hit the switch at 50 kilowatts and stepped back. And all of a sudden I hear CJ yelling. And I couldn't understand what he was yelling. And I run out of the transmitter building and he's waving his hands. And he was yelling, "Fire, fire." Bush had grown up near the tower during the time that the station wasn't running 50 kilowatts. And we set it on fire. So it will happen. Here's another one where a fencing won't pass. I mean, I don't know about the ATU or anything. I mean, it looks kind of neat inside, but again, that's not going to offer you any protection from small animals, children, and anybody else who wants to climb. And plus, this height will probably not be acceptable. There's no deemed height in the rules, but you really want those fences high enough that you're going to really challenge anybody who starts to climb. Make them get a ladder or something like that, so it's very obvious. Lock fence. AMs especially. I mean, FMs, you should have your fences secured and everything. It's got a lock, but it doesn't work. Station not long ago did get a fine. I think the requirement was, I think the new master lock cost them $3,000 and about $5 additional dollars. The $5 for the lock and the $3,000 was the fine. FM power measurements. I think many of you have seen, what the metering looks like on an FM. That one's putting out some serious power. But again, On FM, we're utilizing the indirect method at all times, and so you have to watch out on the calibration of these meters because they're not, we showed that earlier. Again, the indirect power method calculation is very similar to what it is on the AM. Plate voltage meter on your transmitter, many of these going by the wayside because we're all moving into solid state, so we don't have much on plate voltage anymore, at least not in that power output range, not DC kilovolts. Of course, amperes and spectral analysis. And TV guys, they've got it great. So they've upgraded twice. Let's see, back in the mid-2000s, we just upgraded again. And everybody has these wonderful power meters, whether it's Rugged & Schwartz or Agilent, they're great. Plug it in, take the meter, you get your reading, be sure it's calibrated, life is good. I'm sure some of you guys have got one of these, at least in your facility. Some other things to look at, I mentioned maintenance logs earlier, so we don't want to forget about that. Means and procedure to maintain correct modulation levels, that pertains primarily to FM and AM. And the correct frequency. And yes, frequencies change. I mean, I have seen a transmitter that had a software load that just didn't go right, and it decided it wanted to operate on a different channel one night. So keep a frequency counter ahead and check it on a regular basis and be sure that everything's operating within the tolerance of the commission. And of course, good engineering practice here. I had to throw that in. That's a nice setup there. Plenty of test gear. And remember, it's what comes out of the speaker that counts. Or as somebody used to say, reception is reality. A few pictures here. Yeah. I had never been so shocked when I saw this. We were doing a due diligence for a station. If you can find the transmitter building and the guy anchors. And I mean, don't let bushes grow up in your guy anchors. I mean, that's an easy.
Or trees.
Yeah, or trees especially, because bushes turn into trees quickly and you lose a guy wire at the least opportune time.
While you're talking about guy anchors, you know anything behind the science of the metal migrating away from an anchor, and is there any way?
Were you talking about galvanic corrosion? More than likely. That's a problem that has a tendency, there's a lot of different ways that can happen. I am not an expert in that field. I know that Tom Silliman and his folks at ERI have done a lot of studies on it, but a lot of it has to do with soil. Also, a lot of it has to do with any underground pipelines or anything in an immediate area. They had a case of where a main gas line ran adjacent to a transmitter site property, and even though the anchor point was some distance away from it, they detected that it had some effect. I mean, I don't get into that, but yes, that is certainly a problem. This would be a violation right here. I mean, you know, getting a weed eater and a lawnmower is not too hard. And while we haven't talked about electrical, this box almost killed me. I was doing an ABIP inspection, and the engineer said, just step into the building and the light switch is on your left. And I opened the door, and something told me not to go for the light switch. That box was on the other side of the light switch. Yeah, it happens. Things get out of hand. Oh, here's another good ground I found. I was at the same site that had the ground strap that was held on by the vice grips to the tower. And again, you know, good way to put your warning signs up and you notice, in addition to on that fence gate. Measuring pressure here. Oh, a guy got, you laugh, but I know an engineer that got fired over this. He actually, so he didn't want to have to go up to a site and reset a breaker. He set it for it wouldn't go off. It's amazing the building didn't burn down. Yes, and he's still working today. Anybody see anything wrong with that picture?
Yeah. Ground.
Yeah.
Bucket of dirt.
You can't make this stuff up. That's just, you know, what can you say? Here's your guy diffuse replacement. And you laugh. I mean, a number of times I have seen you go in and they don't have a fuse, and they'll do something like this in the place of the fuse.
I never knew a You don't have the penny you put under the screw.
Yeah.
I love the bullet, that's really good.
And that's all I've got. Any questions? Yes, sir.
Going back to the visit logs at the transmitter site.
Yes.
This is something I was going to talk with Larry about. Of course, I'll have to postpone. Doing an electronic version of that log instead of written.
That's fine. That's not a problem.
Now, some of us have been told that we worked in the medical field long enough that our writing looks more like a doctor's than an engineer's. And my hands, I'd much rather type it.
Yeah.
Because now with cell phones, you take a picture of everything, go back and record.
Yeah, no, if you've got logs and everything, Ed's, I can see Ed's chomping at the bit now, and,
Hey, John,
Yeah.
John, I found one of the best little methods to keep track of visits and things is Google Keep.
mhm.
So if you ever, also got a Gmail account, you can get one, and if you install Google Keep on your phone, you can make a note while you're there. You can also make a note from any computer that you've got logged into your Gmail account. So Google Keep is just great for text notes, and you can organize them however you want.
Oh, great, yeah, I mean, we have a similar program, and, I drank the juice, so I have an iPhone, but yeah, if you want to do that electronically, that's fine. You know, you still want to document everything, and the commission would accept that because you show that you're doing there on a regular basis. The ones that a lot of people get caught on, as I mentioned earlier, it goes back to the EAS. You can keep electronic versions, but you better show that you signed it and you've checked that log off.
That's what I was going to ask about next, is if we did that remotely, where you just basically print the doc, you send it to them, and then the chief operator is responsible for printing that out, signing off, and putting it in the file. It looks like everybody's.
You could do it, you can sign it electronically.
Yeah, you can sign it electronically if you want to. But now here's another gotcha. You know, I've seen many ways of doing this. If you sign it electronically, be sure that you've actually checked everything and noted that you've signed it, because sometimes you slip up. But yeah, that's acceptable. I mean, unless the inspector's really mad at you for whatever reason. And especially in today's TV environment, you have remote monitoring systems that they may monitor, 8 or 10 TV stations, including all the EAS, and then they print that log and send it down to the TV chief operator where he signs it and then puts it in a file. So that's ongoing now, acceptable. The main thing is just be sure it's documented, be sure that you can show where you have checked off to determine that you've received the LP1, LP2, and IPAWS test for that week, and that you've actually sent a test that went out on all your facilities. Any other? Yes, sir.
Quick question here on the OSHA guideline. A lot of these transmitter sites that I've seen have got like one door, one way in, one way out. Is there any designation where the fire extinguisher should be placed?
Honestly, I can't answer that question. It depends on the size of the facility. I'd probably have one at the door, and I'd probably have one close to my transmitter site. My transmitter itself, because, if you have a fire while you're in the building, you want to be able to grab it, and sometimes the door is a distance away. The biggest problem, I think, with fire extinguishers is not where they are, is keeping them updated. Most of the times those things are not checked on an annual basis, and they sit out there and expire, and about the only good it is to hit somebody in the head if they were breaking in at that point. So I think you have to use your own good judgment on that. There probably is an OSHA rule somewhere, and frankly, OSHA probably wouldn't say anything until your site burned down and somebody got hurt, and then they'd want to know where the fire extinguisher was. So.
On those
My experience, sometimes the best person to answer that is your insurance company.
Yeah, and they really, you're right, Ed, the insurance companies drive the boat. If the insurance company says where it's supposed to be and they're happy, then everybody's happy because they're the ones going to pay the tab. Vic, you have?
Well, I was going to just mention that most municipalities, if you call up the local fire department and say, hey, would you come out and take a look at my facility?
We'll give you an inspection.
They'd be, and not do an inspection, but come out and tell me what I need to do to make it safer, or what they love to do that.
Yeah, they will, and you also have to be careful too. If your site's like some sites I've seen, they'd come condemn it, you'd be off the air, so.
I was gonna mention, you were talking about I have not seen this at a transmitter site, but my years in the fire service, if you go out to a site or any place and you find one of those old fire extinguishers, that the instruction is that you take it off the wall and turn it upside down. Those baking soda ones, if you see one of those, don't touch it. Call your fire department, let them come get rid of it, because what happens with those things is they corrode inside, those explode.
Oh yeah, they're very dangerous. One more question. I'm getting the hook up here, Kathy. Any other questions? Sure.
Real quick, and I've talked to you offline about this, but when you do ABIP inspections, do you also do Part 74? Translators is what I...
We do. It usually depends on the station. Some will want us to look at their translators.
Because that's a whole different...
It's another whole ball game, and I will tell you about translators. I can tell you I have seen more translators operating overpower illegally than anything else. And it's a real problem. The Commission's aware of it. Slowly but surely they're starting to inspect. In addition to being overpowered, the other problem is the translator is not operating with the antenna that was specified in the construction permit. This is a real catch for most people, because in full class FM stations, you get your construction permit, and whatever size transmitter goes with whichever size antenna bays to achieve your power, and everybody's happy. But in translators, the consultant, because of interference issues with other stations, and to make these translators fit in specific areas, they have specific antennas recommended. It might be a 4-bay half-wave space where you wonder, well, why can't I just put up a 2-bay and stuff like that? And if the Commission shows up on site and that antenna's not up there, and you never file to change that antenna, you're in deep trouble with the Commission, and they are doing that these days. So good point to bring up.
Are they being tough on that modulation issue? Because a lot of folks I've seen get tripped up. You don't get to add that 0.5% for your subcarriers on the translators 100%.
Yeah.
That's it.
I haven't seen that yet, but you know, it's one of those things that the Commission shows up on site to visit you, and they start finding problems. They're going to dig and dig and dig till they can't find anything else. So if you've got a really good and tight ship, most times if they come to visit, they were either there because they had a reason to be there, somebody filed a complaint or there was an issue, or it could be that Washington deemed that all stations in that particular area are being inspected for the same reason. But if you keep a clean ship out there, more than likely you won't have any issues when the inspector shows up. The other thing, if it's not an interference issue or not a Washington mandated inspection, if you've got an ABIP inspection, normally you say, I have my certificate here, and show it to them. They'll say thank you very much, and they'll go on their way. So
That's egregious.
yeah, that's exactly right. Any other questions? We're going to take a break?
Yeah.
Okay, and then Ed's going to get ready, and I'm looking forward to Ed's talk this afternoon.